Hello, Assalamualaikum. I'm Tengku Liyana and I'm a PhD candidate from the Academy of Language Studies UiTM Shah Alam. And my presentation title today is on the importance performance metrics analysis on the factors influencing language ability of Malaysian higher learning ESL learners. Learning a language involves 4 principles, which are comprehensible input, contextualized instruction, creating a low anxiety classroom, and providing opportunities for meaningful engagement in learning activities. In order to achieve these principles, there's a concept that both teachers and learners need to understand. There are 3 sequential segments in the conceptual framework, beginning with the process of exposing or getting exposed to the target language, followed by cognitively processing the information, and finally practicing and performing the language. The stimulus based on this framework consists of inputs that are motivating to spark learners' interest in learning. As a significant factor in second language acquisition, motivation is commonly discussed and described as the component of language learning. Indeed, learning interest and motivation are essential factors in successful language acquisition. While behaviorists suggest that motivation is influenced by positive social models, desired rewards, and the avoidance of unpleasant consequences, cognitivists suggest that motivation is influenced by interesting stimuli, meaningful contents, comprehensible input, and freedom from threat or risk. In the English classroom, teachers should motivate students by providing interesting material and creating an appealing and non-threatening classroom atmosphere. This is because students with a positive attitude and desire to learn will have an increased likelihood of attaining their goals. Beyond conceiving of motivation as the combination of desire and effort to learn, motivation also influences learners' choice of strategy. Another factor discussed in the cognitive learning dimension is memory strategies, as the chosen learning strategy in this study, for the reason that will be explained later. The exposure to English as a second language plays the most important role in the process of language learning, as it determines the rest of other segments in the whole process. There are generally 2 types of exposure, implicit and explicit exposure. But at tertiary level of education, students' exposure to ESL, whether implicitly or explicitly, should be different from those for lower level of education. This is considering the fact that there is the minimum requirement for English level for university entry in Malaysia. Whether it's implicit or explicit, the exposure needs to be constructive enough to motivate learners and encourage them to adopt effective learning strategy. In this study, memory strategies have been chosen as the main strategy of language learning among Malaysian ESL learners due to their familiarity and common practice of memorization since in the early level of education. In fact, Asians have been reported to prefer memorizing practice in language learning, including rote memorization, despite the ineffectuality of the practice. Therefore, teachers are responsible for encouraging the learners to adopt more effectual memory strategies rather than just depending on the rote memorization for an A in the English language examination. Because at the end of the day, English is required in their daily communication as part of the learning medium, and eventually English becomes the requirement for career advancement. One of the objectives of the whole study is to identify the factor or factors that have the higher potential but were given less attention to by the respondents. So using the importance performance metrics analysis available in the Smart PLS software, the following results have been discovered. The difference between implicit and explicit exposure being focused on in this study is on whether or not learners make the intention to learn while getting the exposure. Between the 2 types of exposure, explicit exposure results in the higher importance compared to implicit exposure, but implicit exposure is found to have better performance among respondents. This high performance value on implicit exposure suggests the commonness or regularity of this kind of exposure among the learners. But in reality, they prefer explicit exposure as the more important factor in the learning process. This finding on the high importance but low performance of explicit exposure has brought attention to possible causes such as: number one, were the indicators for explicit exposure in this study overlapped with those of implicit exposure. This theory, however, wasn't supported by the results from the factor analysis, which brought us to the next question. Number two, whether students think that explicit exposure is more beneficial, but in reality, they have been exposed to more implicit than explicit exposure. The best explanation to this question for now is in the overlapping of implicit and explicit exposure. While researchers have been distinguishing implicit and explicit exposure to ESL, this study found the sequential effect of implicit exposure on explicit exposure. In this study, where the receptive skills consist of reading and listening and productive skills consist of speaking and writing activities become the indicator to explicit exposure, the absence of these specific skills in implicit exposure indicators did not mean the students were not engaged in these specific skills. By introducing implicit-explicit exposure to ESL, the connection between indicators in the explicit and implicit exposure can be explained. At tertiary level of education, the English language teaching does not focus on language proficiency, such as in the teaching of grammar and other language mechanics, but more on developing communication skills in the language. For example, learners are exposed to the native speakers whether through speaking to them or listening to one on TV or radio show, so they can become more familiar with the accent and pronunciation. It is also to encourage them to use the language in their daily conversation. These activities of speaking and listening to the natives outside the classroom can be perceived as implicit exposure in the beginning, but as the learners become more aware of what they can learn from these actions and activities, it can result in them getting explicit exposure. Given that the distinct difference between implicit and explicit exposure is in whether or not they have direct intention to learn. Therefore, this study proposed the future researcher to study implicit-explicit exposure as another factor in language learning process and acquisition. As for the other factor that is perceived as important but low in performance among the respondents, memory strategies, the second cognitive learning dimension, proves to be significant in the proposed conceptual framework. Older learners can be familiar with memorization, but they need to be scaffolded with more effective memorization techniques. There are various strategies that learners can apply to enhance the memory of the target language, such as constantly speaking to people speaking in English, making connections of English words to the image of the word, as well as constantly reviewing English words through acting, rhymes, or through singing. They can also practice the language by speaking to a native or simply speak to each other in the target language. In conclusion, in order to have productive English learning experience, researchers and educators need better understanding of the type of explicit exposure to ESL suitable for higher education students. Any kind of exposure they receive should be encouraging them to practice and apply effective memory strategies that result in the improvement of language ability, rather than just applying a rote memorization for the sake of an A in the examination. Future researchers can include implicit-explicit exposure to ESL as an additional factor in the stimulus, that inspires learners' long-term memory of the language to allow them to become a better reader, listener, speaker, and writer of the English language. Thank you.